This is the Tarhu. It's an instrument which I believe was 2006 or 7 was I think the year that it first appeared. The first one was created in Australia by Peter Biffin, and they're now made here on Crete by Stelios Petrakis. The whole Tarhu idea was started, as we said, by Peter Biffin. It was a family of bowed instruments with a round body like this, and inside a cone resonator. The cone resonator can be made of various materials, either wood or other materials. In this particular case, it's made of a type of fabric. And the basic concept, this instrument was created around various other instruments like the yari tambur or Comanche also. This version is based on the Cretan lira, and that's why the playing string length is 29 centimeters, which is typical of the Cretan lira. So what I wanted initially was that this instrument could be played using the technique of a Cretan lira, which is using the fingernails to press the strings. 29 centimeters of string length. The Cretan lira is normally A, D, G, La, Re, Sol, the 3 strings, but here we've added, in this particular case, a 4th higher, so we've added an extra D or Re above that, and then below that another 4th below, another D string down there, another Re. This is the way I tune it, but there are many ways. You could tune the whole thing in 5ths if you like, or in 4ths, so as you wish you could tune it, really. But what you have to be careful of is the fact that this instrument, because it has sympathetic strings, but the sympathetic strings are running through the neck and up here into the peg box, the upper peg box. So the whole idea there was that we wanted the 29 centimeters string length for the Cretan lira playing technique. But we also know that sympathetic strings work, the longer they are, the better they work. So that's why we wanted them approximately double the length of the playing string, so that it would get a better response. So the strings were put, the sympathetic strings, going underneath the bridge and through the neck. So what happens is this. Inside, as we said, there is a cone resonator. It's a cone like this, but with a sort of a little round plateau on the top. The sound post goes through an opening here and rests on the plateau on the top of the cone. But you must be very careful that it just touches it and exerts a little bit of pressure, not very much. And otherwise it'll damage the cone. Or also it doesn't sound particularly good when there's too much pressure on the cone. So what we have is this bar at the back of the instrument here, which is adjusted by 2 screws. And this bar actually adjusts the angle of the sympathetic strings running under the bridge, either an acute angle or a rather sweeter angle like that, depending on how much pressure you put on this bar. So that means that this bar regulates the amount of pressure coming from the sympathetic strings upwards in relation to the pressure of the playing strings pushing downwards. So what you want is slightly more pressure pressing downwards than you have pressing upwards, so that the bridge here and the sound post is touching the cone but not really exerting any pressure. So when you strike the bass string here and you try and lift up the bass side of the bridge, it should fairly easily disengage from the cone. Here it's engaged, here it's disengaged. So it should be relatively easy. If you cannot disengage it from the cone by lifting on the right side here, that means that you've got too much pressure and you have to release tension by this bar here. That's a very important detail. We also have this tiny little piece of wood under the bridge on the other side. Different people use different materials. I know that Peter Biffin uses a metal pin. For this particular type of tarhu, I like these little wooden blocks myself. And I found that it's very good when they actually touch the side of the instrument over here. It's very, very important. If they're completely free, for some reason it doesn't produce such a nice sound. But if they're actually touching against the side here, for some odd reason, which I don't understand, they sound much better. That's just some of the way instruments are in many ways. So you have 2 possibilities for strings. This particular one is strung with Larsen cello strings and one viola A string, or an electric guitar flat wound second string B. So that's one way of stringing it with the metal strings. This is rather easier to bow, and it's probably a bit more responsive to faster bowing as well. Myself, on my own tarhus, I've always preferred the multifilament strings, which I make myself actually. And they're strings, the whole idea of them is based on the idea which you find in the Central Asian morinkhur, or in the Egyptian rababa, or the old Turkish rabab. Instruments which used to use a horsehair string, a sort of a hank of horsehair as a string, rather like the bow. I did that initially with this. I made horsehair strings for it. They sounded wonderful, of course, but they were totally uncontrollable from the point of view of tuning, because they had to be very tight to use the nail technique. So that I couldn't really control them, because they're very badly affected by heat and damp. So even the friction of the bow on the string creates heat, which puts it out of tune. So just the act of playing puts it out of tune quite quickly. So what I decided to do is I made multi-filament strings out of very, very thin gauges, or different thin gauges of fishing line. And I found those strings to have a very beautiful warm sound, a rather sort of breathy sound in a way. It's a bit like you get a bit confused. Is this a wind or a string instrument if you don't see it? And I've always liked those particular strings, but some people prefer the metal strings because it suits their style of playing and their sound aesthetic. An interesting and very important detail, in my view, in the Nak tarhus which are made by Stelios Petrakis, is the fact that it's very easy to open the back of the instrument and make adjustments to the cone. Initially, the back would be glued, and this, of course, meant that it was quite a major operation if you want to make any adjustments to the cone. You can now actually take the back off within a matter of seconds. And not only that, but it's just a matter of a small number of screws inside to actually change the cone. So what you could do is you could potentially have cones made with different configurations of bracing on the inside, or made of different materials, different thicknesses, different types of cones you can have. So you could actually interchange them and have a different sound quality depending on which cone you use. That's one of the developments which is coming up. So this detail of being able to open the back and work on the cone and adjust it is very important. It gives you a lot of possibilities to modify the sound to exactly what you would like. For the sympathetic strings, we tune them in a chromatic scale, starting, for example, here, the bass one is an A. Like the A you find in the first position of the second bar. For these strings on this side, all these strings on this side are the thin gauge of saz strings. So they're basically 0.18. If you can't find saz strings, I know that Daddario does actually make, and you can actually buy 0.18 wound strings. They'll do the job. But I find the saz strings are really the best, if you can find those. And then we have the other ones here. I tend to use, for the next two, a 0.12 plain steel string, either 2 or 3 of those. And then you can use either the 0.11 and finally 0.10 or 0.9, depending on your instrument. Some like thinner, some like thicker ones. But these are just plain steel strings, starting from 0.12, going up to 0.10, I would say, yeah. And maybe you do 3 12s and 2 11s and 1 10. There are different ways of doing that, depending on exactly what you want. Also, putting a different bridge on the tarhu would also make major alteration to the sound quality of it. So some people experiment with the bridge using thicker, thinner, lighter wood, heavier wood, bridges with designs carved into them so that there's less wood mass. All sorts of possibilities are there, and it's sort of open for experimentation, really. You have to always be making slight adjustments here to this little piece of wood there. When they're new, for them, they take time to settle in, and all the sort of the different tensions and the different pressures from above and below and things take a bit of time to settle down. Once they do that, after a couple of months usually, then they're pretty stable instruments, and they don't tend to lose their tuning very easily at all. So that's the basic information about the Tarhu.